I don't know how to get it. Vale.
Para lo de las vídeos.
Vale.
¿Sí?
Hello, welcome to online as well. It's pleasure to introduce GRANDEZA lecturer in body quick we have Alienated here to speak with the directors of GRANDEZA, Amaia, Sánchez-Velasco, Oriol, to speak about the work that in 2011 and recently collaborated with GRANDEZA on the commission of emissions to do Australian formulation in 2019 and which what do. The work of GRANDEZA has continually denied any separation between accessibility in theory. And in that it's part of quite unique position. It centers on exposing near-viruses at play in later capitalist spaces and using strategically using what one could call very alive imagination. So doing.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation and for the invitation, Francesca. Thank you, Mel, as well, and Salo. We are very pleased to be here today. I don't know, I mean, we were thinking of not using the microphone. Is the audio okay from there and on Zoom? Yeah? Okay. So we are, Francesca just mentioned, Amaia Sánchez-Velasco and Jorge Oriol, architects, educators, and researchers. Co-founders of GRANDEZA Studio. So today we're going to talk about the project that we did in Iran, but also other projects to somehow unpack our work.
As Francesca was mentioning, we are co-founders together with Gonzalo Valiente of GRANDEZA, a studio founded in Madrid in 2011. And since 2017, we have been collaborating with Miguel Rodríguez Casella, alias BAJEZA, not only in the Teatro Della Terra Alienata project, but in many other projects. And we would like to acknowledge that most of the work that we are presenting today has been developed and thought in collaboration with them, as well as with many other companions that are not here today, but we are not talking on their behalf, but kind of trying to represent them humbly today. So our work studies late capitalist spaces and narratives to identify through critical analysis and challenge through political imagination the mechanisms that conceal and normalize neoliberal violence.
Today, we will present a lecture that aims at unpacking some of the methodologies, theories of design, philosophical inquiries, and political questions that drive our practice. And we do it with an emphasis on making them useful for you, an audience formed by both educators and students who are asking or being asked to engage with questions and challenges that resonate with our own. And it is in response to the exhilarating syllables that Francesca and Miguel are proposing to you, and finding ourselves bracket amongst the return of the body to architectural discourses, alive and kicking, and the complete reshuffling of the body politics as we have known them so far, that we will present today the facts and fictions that our own creative practice delves into.
That's the title of the lecture, Alienated Bodies, Tales from the Interregnum, where the alienated bodies represent our bodies and those of the companions that we have been lucky to have so far, all in service of rehearsal, a trial and error, of hypothesis making, of world making, and of a necessary process of collective unlearning. In the words of Ursula K. Le Guin, to make a new world, you start with an old one, certainly. to find a world, maybe you have to have lost one. Maybe you have to be lost. The dance of renewal, the dance that made the world, was always danced here, at the edge of things, on the brink, on the foggy coast.
Philosopher Marina Garcés calls us to embody. In her work, the problem of critique has traditionally been a problem of conscience. Today, it is a problem of the body. How do we incarnate critique? How does critical thought acquire a body? If critique was used traditionally to combat darkness, today it must combat impotence. She continues by saying, the global world is illuminated. Our minds are enlightened. There is nothing which we don't see. Misery, lies, exploitation, torture. Sorry, we're going to.
The presentation has videos and they are not.
They're not playing.
Microphone? Sí. We are a little problem. Videos are not being reproduced in the presentation.
And there are like a lot of videos,
Yeah.
So it's better to solve it now.
So the
If
PowerPoint.
we do it as presentation, it won't. It's there. So, you know.
But it's in the PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we do it as presentation, we don't, without seeing the next slide, that's what the fact. We should.
And where is the video?
I think it's probably because of the separation of the screens. Now it's
No, it's
playing.
playing. Okay. So
we get back.
It's better if you use the microphone.
Okay.
Okay.
A little louder. Yeah,
Louder.
use the
Yes.
microphone.
Okay,
So I'm gonna reread this passage, which I think it looks much better with the video. In the words of Ursula K. Le Guin, to make a new world, you start with an old one, certainly. To find a world, maybe you have to have lost one. Maybe you have to be lost. The dance of renewal, the dance that made the world, was always danced here, at the edge of things, on the brink, on the foggy coast.
philosopher Marina Garcés calls us to embody critique. In her words, the problem of critique has traditionally been a problem of conscience. Today, it is a problem of the body. How do we incarnate critique? How does critical thought acquire a body? If critique was used traditionally to combat darkness, today it must combat impotence. She continues by saying, the global world is completely illuminated. Our minds are enlightened. There is nothing which we don't see. Miseries, lies, exploitation, torture, exclusion, etc. All are completely exposed and brought to light. Nonetheless, we feel capable of doing so little about ourselves, for our world. We can say it all, and nonetheless, we have nothing relevant to add. According to Garcés, to embody critique is not to find the correct wording, nor to become complacent in the gardens of root conscience, nor to sell the cheapest solution to existing institutions. To embody critique means to ask how to subvert one's life nowadays in such a way that the world can no longer remain the same.
Although we could argue here that the world will no longer be the same regardless of what we do with our bodies, we cannot deny that our alienated bodies are already on stage. We are in the midst of a new scene of enunciation, as Jacques Rancière would say. Welcome to the planetary interregnum. In his latest book, Can the Monster Speak?, philosopher Paul B. Preciado argues that the epistemic crisis we are experiencing today, evidenced by our generalized incapacity to respond to the current planetary challenges, is triggering a paradigm shift. Following the studies by Thomas Kuhn, Preciado asserts that paradigms are universes of discourses, where a certain coherence, a certain peace, and a certain agreement reign. But paradigms are not worlds of immutable sense. Until a paradigm is completely shifted by another one, he continues, the accumulation of unresolved matters does not generate paradoxically a lucid critical response, but a temporary stiffening of the theoretical grounds upon which the paradigm in crisis has been constructed.
Almost a century earlier, during his deadly time in custody, Antonio Gramsci wrote a compelling while pessimistic note about the interregnum as a time when the old is dying and the new world struggles to be born, a time of monsters. Gramsci's alarming call, written during another socio-political shift, reminds us of the potentially devastating effects of such forms of ideological stiffening during paradigm shifts. At that moment, the monsters of fascism were sequestrating the imaginaries of the future and convincing the masses of the lack of solidarity that dissent, disagreement, or simple opposition represented for the purity and prosperity of the nation, a statement that unfortunately still sounds too familiar.
Almost a century earlier, during his deadly time in custody, Antonio Gramsci wrote a compelling while pessimistic note about the interregnum as a time. Sorry, I'm reading sorry, we have another technical problem. That is, this is not the. Sorry, we come from the University of Technology, Sydney. And these things happen. Sorry, we are not used at all to split screens. I got there. Can we close the presentation and do it again?
So this is like advertisement in the middle of the lecture. Don't forget the plot. Okay.
Okay, we are here.
Planetary interregnums.
Let's see if it works now, hopefully. Indeed, within today's planetary interregnum, we are witnessing a proliferation of enactments of epistemic stiffening, which we see as the agonizing reactions of an old paradigm, Western, colonial, patriarchal, etc., that has lost the capacity to resolve the problem it produces. We use here the term enactment with its double meaning. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, to enact means to perform a story or a play, in this case through a calculated entanglement of signs, specialities, performativity, discourses, bodies, and props, etc. It also means to put something into action, especially to make something law. This prophetic enactment of epistemic stiffening often states seemingly different but equally deterministic visions of our pasts, presents, and potential futures. These enactments are sometimes performed through the ritualized repetition of reactionary religious, cultural, and economic dogmas, or by the exaltation of symbols, but also in the form of macho-futurist techno-displays that sequestrate our capacity to imagine alternative future abilities, while staging the expansion of the extractivist regime beyond the limits of an exhausted Earth. Deus ex machina, technology will save us.
In 2016, far-right wing Brazilian lawmaker Jair Messias Bolsonaro leaned back into River Jordan, a white robe to be baptized in the arms of a fellow congressman and evangelical pastor. Bolsonaro's spectacularized baptism was crucial to gain the support of growing ultra-religious groups. While still an avowed Catholic, Bolsonaro is riding a wave of support from Brazil's evangelical Christians who helped him win the presidential elections. Many were captivated by Bolsonaro's eager embrace of the cultural wars and his strident anti-LGBTI+ and anti-indigenous rhetoric. Since he came to power, Bolsonaro's destructive push to expand large-scale mining and agribusiness in the Amazon has dramatically increased deforestation on indigenous land. According to data from the Indigenous Missionary Council, since January 2019, land invasions in indigenous territories more than doubled from the same period in the previous year. According to Menton, Research Associate in Environmental Justice from the University of Sussex, the Brazilian government is actively encouraging violence against indigenous defenders through hate speech, accusing indigenous leaders and environmentalists of promoting foreign interests in the Amazon, and has repeatedly threatened to end the policy of land demarcation, whereby indigenous communities are granted the right to clearly defined territories. More recently, Bolsonaro's government has issued 2 decrees to boost gold prospecting, which will particularly impact the Amazon rainforest.
On February 6, 2018, a gigantic phallic space rocket propelled by 2 testicular side boosters left Earth's orbit in search of other planets to colonize and fecundate. A day after, media attention was globally drawn onto what would become one of the world's most disseminated scenographic stages of the 21st century, a convertible midnight cherry Tesla Roadster floating in outer space. The genetic material ejected by this heroic onanistic gesture liberated its driver, Starman, a mannequin dressed up in a spacesuit made in Elon Musk's image and likeness. A successful white male entrepreneur fleeing the Earth while using it as an Instagramic backdrop. The image became a symbolic gesture of the departure of the entrepreneurialization of the space race after the US Congress passed in May 2015 the Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship Act, known as SPACE Act by its acronyms, which explicitly allows US citizens and industries to engage in the commercial exploration and exploitation of spatial resources, quote unquote, including water and minerals, arguably in violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that prevents any state to exercise national appropriation by claim of sovereignty by means of or use or occupation or by any other means, quote unquote, of extraterrestrial bodies.
Beyond their metaphorical connotations, these 2 enactments of epistemic stiffening allow us to trace the tentacular geographies that connect the bodies of these strong men on stage with the material, legal, and transcalar manifestations of their enunciations. Both Bolsonaro's spectacularized baptism and Elon Musk's stratospheric ejaculation disseminate, reproduce, normalize, naturalize, perpetuate, and further expand the perceived inevitability of extractivist and colonial regimes. But as Bruno Latour warns us in Down to Earth, Politics in the New Climatic Regime, he says, don't be fooled for a second by those who preach the call for wide open spaces of risk-making, those who abandon all protection and continue to point to the infinite horizon of modernization for all. Those apostles take risks only if their own comfort is warranted. Instead of listening to what they are saying about what lies ahead, look instead at what lies behind them. You'll see the gleam of the carefully folded golden parachutes of everything that ensures them against the random hazards of existence.
From his apartment in Uranus as well, Preciado invites us to imagine dissident theaters to resist the violence of the hegemonic performative. But to imagine, we need to start by challenging the apparent dichotomy between constative utterances and performative utterances. Accepting the common theory of language, we can assert that the difference between constative and performative utterances lie in the quality of the former to describe reality and the power of the latter to transform it. It is raining today utters a constative fact. I declare you husband and wife produces or performs an effect in reality. But according to Preciado, Derrida postulates that the success of a performative utterance does not depend on a transcendent power of language, a kind of divine voice declaring, "Let there be light," but rather from the simple repetition of a social ritual that, legitimized by power, hides its historicity. A theater where the words and characters are determined by convention. Performative force, he continues, is the result of the violent imposition of a norm that we prefer to call nature to avoid confronting the reorganization of the social relationships of power that any change in conventions would bring about. Preciado also observes that Judith Butler goes even farther in her thinking about utterances on identity, gender identity, but also sexual and racial identity, man, woman, homosexual, black, etc., as performative utterances that pass as constative, words that produce what they are supposed to describe. For the subaltern, Preciado concludes, speaking implies not simply resisting the violence of the hegemonic performative, but above all, imagining dissident theaters where the production of a different performative force can be possible. Preciado invite us to disidentify ourselves in order to reconstruct the subjectivity damaged by the dominant performative language. How can counter rituals be created? By taking a chance on another performative utterance, who will we become?
In that sense, we feel summoned by the necessity to frame today's planetary interregnum as the time-space in which inherited quote-unquote truths are historically contingent and therefore transformable, against the enactments of epistemic stiffening that frame capitalism's, patriarchies, supremacisms, colonialisms as inherent to human nature or unavoidable. We propose instead a critical act of defamiliarization and anti-naturalization. This is what we call enactments of alienation from such epistemological constructs, and we see them as a first step towards the imagination of new worlds. But what does alienation entail? Karl Marx's theory of alienation refers to the process by which the workers feel disconnected from their product, from the product of their own labor, Verfremdung, from the act of production, from the work of others, and from other workers, and consequently from their own species essence, Gattungswesen. But the assumption that there is such a species essence takes for granted the condition of the human as universal. Within the framework of her post-human theory, philosopher Rossi Braidotti reminds us that not all of us are human to the same degree. Indeed, the human is not a neutral term, but it is a term that indexes access to power, to visibility, or to credibility. Italian-American scholar Silvia Federici joins this critique of the not evenly distributed condition of the human. In her 2018 article, Marx and Feminism, as well as in her book, Caliban and the Witch, she states that Marx's work is fundamental to relating gender and class, feminism and anti-capitalism. She acknowledges that Marx's work provided essential tools for understanding how primitive accumulation was centered on the expulsion of the peasants from the land, the inclusion of the commons, and the formation of the wage working class. However, she explains how his work offered a limited view on how capitalism exploited women's labor beyond wages. She claims that while the peasantry was expropriated from their communal land, women were removed from the public sphere, expropriated from their bodies, and subsumed to the mandate of reproduction as a form of unpaid labor. She states that turning women's bodies into machines for reproduction of future laborers and soldiers ultimately enabled the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe and its colonial expansion into the New World. Federici states that a critical analysis of capitalism and its intrinsic division of labor must comprise the role in sustaining growth of the wageless, of reproductive labor, of slave labor, and of the migrant labor. She sees in the erasure of reproductive activities and wage labor in Marx's work the symptom of a systemic failure.
In opposition to Marx's essentialist Pathologizing and Limited Take on Alienation, our work joins a genealogy of authors who see in the estrangement of the alienated subject an instrument for the denormalization of everyday life, as well as an opportunity to challenge inherited epistemologies, and therefore a necessary step towards cognitive emancipation. Our work also allows itself to be infected by the alienation effect or distancing effect of Bertolt Brecht's epic theater, Verfremdungseffekt, which explicitly states the trick, the artificiality of the dramaturgy instead of hiding it, to ultimately force the audience to take a critical position with and within the plot. In the word of Brecht, theatrical illusion must be partial so that it always can be recognized as an illusion. Brecht's epic theater distanced itself from Aristotelian theater, that on the contrary, created the conditions of immersion by a process of emotional identification between a spectator and actor through the use of tricks that were meant to produce an effect of apparent naturalism. For Brecht, this process would temporarily suspend the incredulity of the audience in favor of the construction of an empathetic link between audience and characters called catharsis. In that sense, Aristotelian theater was, according to Brecht, hiding, invisibilizing, and naturalizing the relations of power that were fictionally staged. Aristotelian theater was, for Brecht, an apparatus of normalization. But if Brecht's theater was most notably known by asking the audience to believe deeply in something that was obviously artificial and fake, ultimately transforming the language of theater, cinema, and the arts until today, it is its effect outside the theater space, that of making the audience aware of the artificiality that is employed as well in the construction of reality, what has made epic theater a fundamental contribution not only to theater, but to political art in a broader sense. Indeed, this is what produces an affirmative and emancipatory cognition. Reality is constructed, and as such, we can participate in its construction. In Brecht's own words, art is not a mirror with which to reflect reality, but a hammer with which to shape it.
We also take on Jacques Rancière's assertion in his chapter, Is History a Form of Fiction?, from his book, The Politics of Aesthetics, that, in which he says, the real must be fictionalized in order to be thought. Rancière's take on the idea that fiction essentially belongs to the domain of empirical reality is for us an important and useful hypothesis. According to Rancière, politics and art, like forms of knowledge, construct fictions. That is to say, material rearrangements of signs and images, relationships between what is seen and what is said, between what is done and what can be done. This hypothesis allows us to deconstruct the dichotomy between fact and counterfact, between reality and fiction. But taking it away from the dangerous path of post-truth and fake news to a space of criticality and speculative fabulation. Indeed, for acclaimed thinker Donna Haraway, author of the Cyborg Manifesto, telling stories is by no means escaping reality, but instead a way of taking on the commitment to give voice to worldviews which differ from hegemonic thinking of the West, In the 2016 documentary, Storytelling for Earthly Survival, Haraway stands for the imagination of universes populated by trans-futurist species and the necessity to tell stories of resistance against colonization and capitalism. Furthermore, in Gaia Global Circus, Bruno Latour claims that the current environmental concerns are incomprehensible in their scale, their ubiquity, and their duration, and that perhaps it is through techniques of representation that they can become legible to the senses.
Our work also feeds from the take on alienation disseminated by Laboria Cuboniks in their Xenofeminist Manifesto, egalitarian, universalist, mutant, depetrifying, anti-naturalist, and open to collective self-mastery. XF seizes alienation as an impetus to generate new worlds. We are all alienated, but have we ever been otherwise? It is through and not despite our alienated condition that we can free ourselves from the map of immediacy. Freedom is not a given, and it is certainly not given by anything natural. The construction of freedom involves not less but more alienation. Alienation is the labor of freedom's construction. When referring to the subtitle of the Xenofeminist Manifesto, A Politics for Alienation, one of its authors, Patricia Reed, that I think you will know soon, asserts that the search for more alienation rather than less is a provocation. The XF Manifesto does not refer to the type of debilitating alienation that is used by Marxist theory to describe labor relations, not the type of alienation that certain types of bodies experience from the social sphere due to gender, class, or racial markers. Instead, XF makes a claim for epistemological alienation, which implies a negotiation with the unfamiliar. Alienation is framed as a way to create conceptual separation from the familiar orders and from existing norms that actually produce those oppressive forms of social exclusion.
The Xenofeminist Manifesto is a call to action, articulated around a series of verbs: interrupt, trap, adjust, and overflow. Xenofeminism partially aligns itself with accelerationism, which imagines the end of capitalism through the deployment of its own means, calling for the use of existing technology to re-engineer the world while remaining cautious that technology isn't inherently progressive nor neutral. Quote, the radical opportunities afforded by developing and alienating forms of technological mediation should no longer be put to use in the exclusive interest of capital, which by design only benefit the few. The manifesto puts forward a new rationality, to imagine a world beyond current understandings of gender, race, and class. It defines itself as anti-naturalist, upholding the queer and trans amongst us, the differently able, as well as those who have suffered discrimination due to pregnancy or duties connected to child rearing. We quote, we need new affordances of perception and action and blinkered by naturalized identities. In the name of feminism, nature shall no longer be a refuge of injustice or a basis for any political justification whatsoever. If nature is unjust, change nature.
Halfway between theory fiction, speculative fabulation, audiovisual research, and dramaturgy, Teatro Della Terra Alienata stages a fictional scenario of territorial secession, alienating the Great Barrier Reef and its catchment areas from the current paradigm of extraction. Inspired by the XF Manifesto, the project proposes a reappropriation, expansion, and concatenation of existing technologies of surveillance and environmental management embedded in the life cycles of the reef. The poetic resignification and the methodical profanation of the current infrastructures of extraction, the region is sequestrated by a fictional xenofeminist international corporation in collaboration with the United Nations. The reef becomes a re-territorializing laboratory where post-national forms of citizenship, slowing down economies, and policies of open borders are collectively enacted. An intersectional and multi-species army of citizen parliaments, liberated from the mandates of productivity and reproductivity, inhabit the transition from an economy of things to an economy of joy, beauty, and contemplation. The Great Barrier Reef, one of the few environments alongside the Amazon rainforest, the Sahara Desert, and the Antarctic glaciers, that manages to sneak into the global imaginary of the sublime. It is considered the largest living structure on Earth. It hosts 9,000 different species of marine life and myriad types of microbes, plankton, and fungi. Extending across 2,100 kilometers, it is the largest coral reef ecosystem on the planet, and it's visible from space. Contrary to colonial constructions of the line, supported by the idea of a pristine wilderness, the Great Barrier Reef and its catchment areas have been inhabited by Aboriginal Australian and Torres Strait Islanders peoples for tens of thousands of years. Despite the historical processes of dispossession, genocide, expulsion of local populations, the GBR is still today culturally significant for close to 70 Aboriginal traditional owner groups.
In 2016, 2017, and 2020, 3 consecutive mass coral bleaching events are visible the plausible death of the Great Barrier Reef. one of UNESCO's most significant World Heritage Sites. In response to this catastrophic forecast, in 2018, the Australian government decided to partially outsource the preservation of this natural, quote-unquote, natural wonder and quote-unquote, natural treasure. Without any competitive tender process, the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, a charity supported by major mining corporations, banks, insurance companies, and airlines, received the biggest government donation for environmental protection to date, almost 500 million Australian dollars. The foundation's board lineup included executives from heavy polluting corporations such as AGL, BHP, Shell, and Peabody Energy, a company that funded climate change denialist groups in the United States, and even praised former President Donald Trump's decision to withdraw from the 2015 Paris Agreement. The Great Barrier Reef supports the Australian government's Reef 2050 long-term sustainability plan, which refuses to call for specific actions against climate change. Instead, the foundation promotes resilience, restoration, and innovation to buy the reef time by deploying technological local fixes, aiming to keep the so-called natural spectacle alive. This techno-utopian theater, indeed, an enactment of epistemic stiffening, is in charge of monitoring the reef's fate and building the general public's hope for the possibility of its recovery. So far, these strategies have managed to exclude the Great Barrier Reef from UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites in danger. Meanwhile, the biggest threat to the reef's survival, a hegemonic economic system depending on fossil fuels and unbridled growth, keeps expanding globally and locally. For instance, following more than 10 years of controversy and against the scientific evidence that demands phasing out fossil fuels, the multinational conglomerate Adani Group opened the Carmichael coal mine in a vast area of the Galilee Basin, claimed by the Wanjan and Jalingo people, just 350 kilometers inland from the reef.
Teatro Della Terra Alienata addresses the urgency raised by the United Nations IPCC report published in 2018, which framed the decay of the Great Barrier Reef as part of a wicked problem that demands radical political actions along with new imaginaries and aesthetic regimes. Teatro Della Terra Alienata was the Australian pavilion at the 22nd Triennale di Milano Broken Nature Design Takes on Human Survival in 2019, where it received the Golden Bee Award for the best international contribution. The book, published in 2022, and coinciding with the acquisition of the work by the National Gallery of Victoria for its inclusion in the permanent collection of contemporary design and architecture, was written as an intertextual collaborative exercise that questions inherited dogmas of academic publication in terms of format, content, and authorship, including the individualized accountability of outcomes. The core text is the script of the film, which is intersected or alienated by 182 footnotes that trespass the book from cover to back cover, unpacking the philosophical, political, spatial, economical, methodological, environmental, and discursive grounds that support the staged fiction. The project was produced by GRANDEZA and BAJEZA in collaboration with 6 complicit artists, Side Maidemir, Liam Benson, Madison Bycroft, Southey Dertz, Janet Lawrence, and Patricia Reed. And it reflects upon the conversations, research, and testimonies of scientists, activists, Aboriginal elders, miners, designers, and thinkers, as well as academics and students from the University of Technology Sydney's School of Design, Architecture, and Life Sciences. And we have a couple of copies of the book here that you can have a look later.
Consequently, Teatro Della Terra Alienata imagines the alienation of the Great Barrier Reef and its catchment areas from Australia's Commonwealth sovereign control, as well as its inclusion in a fictional geopolitical bloc, a translocal project of emancipation known as the ATTACK, Archipelago of Territories Alienated from Capitalism. Indeed, we articulate our body of work as a concatenation of transscalar and transtemporal geographies inscribed within this political fiction. As a hypothesis, the emergence of a post-capitalist archipelago offers an alternative to the planetary neoliberal hegemony, reviving the agonistic potential of 20th century confrontations between capitalist and socialist mythologies, but Far from perpetuating the productivist and imperialist dialectics originally shared by both blocs of the Cold War era, the attack brands itself as a distributed and porous post-national constellation of techno-cosmovisions, subjectivities, and culture territories set on cultivating non-violent, radically democratic, and therefore pluri-atmospheric forms of kinship and interdependence between living and dying bodies across the planet. The attack imagines a paradigm shift that dignifies the unproductive, shifting away from narratives of resilience, growth, salvation, purpose, improvement, success, and adaptation to embrace malfunction, failure, imbalance, or lack of purpose as legitimate virtues of both living and non-living things. And we would like to close our presentation today, if we have time. Do we have time to extend 15 minutes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. With the technical problems, there was a little bit of a mess. We would like to finish the presentation with a project, an ongoing project that is located at the northwestern Australian region of the Pilbara, where we are developing a research and pedagogic project called Pilbara Interregnum, 7 Acts of Alienation.
The Pilbara is an immense, arid, and thinly populated territorial crust in the northwestern Australia. Since the first Anglo-Saxon incursions only 160 years ago in that part of Australia, the Pilbara's prolific mineral deposits have been extracted under an alleged national consensus around Australia's lucky country and fair go mythologies. Despite today's planetary hold, fostered by the disruption of the pandemic, the Pilbara Ports Authority has broken its annual mineral exports record, consolidating its non-official title as the powerhouse of the nation, while deepening the existing wealth inequalities in the area and beyond.
The Pilbara exists today as a spatio-temporal battlefield of colonial exploitation, expulsions, and explosions. The material and imaginary conditions of this battlefield simultaneously manifest past, present, and future struggles, often experienced all at once as a legacy, ongoing process, and emerging reality. This project delves into the messiness of the spatio-temporal battlefield by intervening 7 situated battlegrounds. These battlegrounds transcend their geographic demarcations by connecting local territorial disputes with ongoing global struggles. Rejecting the reductive framing of the Pilbara as a passive, extractive, and remote hinterland, this project situates the region at the center stage of the most radical political and epistemological transformations of our time. The tentacular geographies of the Pilbara become, in this project, the testing ground in which to imagine alternative planetary alliances beyond the techno-deterministic and neo-colonial futurabilities that have sequestrated the region.
The project uses allegorical representation, both as a research and a design method, to unpack the region's political, cultural, and environmental struggles. Each of these 7 acts of alienation take the form of microfictions that imagine alternative social and ecological contracts. The 7 actions that guide each of the allegorical microfictions transform the Pilbara from a resources battlefield into an epistemological war of political imagination. Today, we will introduce them by navigating their location, the factual events unique to each of the disputes, as well as the theoretical questions that each of these fictions address. Unearth, re-earth. Location, from Barrow Peninsula to Marandu Mine. Factual events. In April 2008, the Talangi people reburied 6 ancestral skeletal relics back in their homeland, in Onslow. These vestiges were part of an ongoing reparation process through which the Amaia Aboriginal Language Center has recuperated remains from Australian and international museums and collections. However, reparation processes still coexist with colossal acts of destruction. Hundreds of artifacts and significant sites are still threatened by the ever-expanding extractive industries. For instance, in 2019, Anglo-Australian mining giant Rio Tinto blasted the Yukon Gorge, a significant Aboriginal site known as the only inland site in Australia with evidence of continuous human occupation for over 46,000 years. In 2021, following the federal inquiry on this matter, investigations revealed that Rio Tinto had already dumped hundreds of Eastern Guruma cultural artifacts at a rubbish dump in Darwin. The artifacts, some of them up to 18,000 years old, had been extracted from the Marandu mine. Back in the 1990s, the resurgence of this operation after 25 years of corporate and governmental silence comes back to haunt the public debate and reclaim a dignifying reparation.
Act of alienation. This capsule fictionalizes the sequestration of the infrastructures of mineral distribution to put them in service of a colossal act of critical reparation. In this context, the extractive apparatus would become an infrastructure for speculative archaeologists, enable the return and the protection of missing cultural artifacts and bodies from national and international museums and archives, while also confiscating the ubiquitous monuments dedicated to heterocolonial heroes in a critical act of collective profanation. This capsule interrogates architecture's symbolic and operational capacities to negotiate collective memories. It does not envision a consensual solution. Instead, it stages current debates and conflictive visions by imagining an arena in which unearthing and re-earthing would operate as dialectical tools.
Could current infrastructural networks of extraction and distribution become an infrastructure for reparation or memorialization?
How to shift from a paradigm of mining as a national endeavor towards one of reparation as a national endeavor?
How would this question sit within the current re-interrogation of artifacts, archives, museums, and monuments that have so long been complicit in the crystallization and perpetuation of imperial narratives?
And frame. Location, Carnarvon Artesian Basin. Factual event. In July 2021, mining giants such as the Anglo-Australian BHP and Rio Tinto, the Australian FMG and the Canadian Cameco, amongst others, invested in research projects to unravel the mysteries of stygofauna in Western Australia and the Northern Territories. Stygofauna is a term derived from Greek mythology, in which travelers crossed the river Styx as they descended into Aedes, the unseen, god of the dead and king of the underworld. While among Australia's quietest and least visible creatures, stygofauna holds mystery and power over the shape and size of some of Australia's biggest mines. The Pilbara region in Western Australia is one of the world's hotspots for stygofauna, which coincides with a high concentration of iron ore mines. More than 95% of Western Australian iron ore is extracted from large open pit mines that require the removal of groundwater, dewatering, to provide access to the ore that sits below the water table. Dewatering affects the spring, karstic, and porous alluvial aquifers. The balance of vast groundwater deposits is fundamental for both the region's future, whose rainfall is expected to decrease as a result of climate change, and for the preservation of this underground ecosystem.
Act of alienation. The Pilbara's endemic blind cave eel, Ophisternum candidum, is a unique stygofauna species. Being blind, invisible, and inhabiting the underworld, this creature invites us to unlearn the inherited dependence on visual perception of Western epistemologies, such as the picturesque or the sublime. Instead, this monster calls us to engage with estrangement and imagine what the unpicturesque or the unsublime could be. How can these invisible creatures contribute to develop preservation policies beyond reductive UNESCO's heritage listing and traditional natural park demarcations?
How to love the unknown and the intangible?
How to admire the invisible ugliness of these monsters?
Why preserve the life of others?
How to disidentify ourselves from inherited epistemological frameworks that foster multi-species alliances? Deviate. Location, Mars and the Pilbara's Marble Bar. Factual event. In 2015, Associate Professor Patrice Ray and Dr. Claire Mallard from the School of Geosciences at the University of Sydney extracted a 5 mm by 1 mm fragment of red earth from the Pilbara's town of Marble Bar. The researchers are examining the parallelisms between this rock formation and those from Mars. Both formed roughly 3.4 billion years ago, hoping that they can get clues about Mars's history and find evidence of past life. 5 years later, on the 19th of February 2021, at 7:55 a.m. city time, and after 7 months and 485 million kilometer journey, NASA's Perseverance rover successfully landed on Mars, carrying that little fragment of the Pilbara. In the words of Associate Professor Ray, we are sending a geological postcard from Australia to Mars. The scientists involved in this project say that Pilbara also holds the key to understanding the origins of our world.
Act of alienation. Departing from the material evidence of the postcard, this microfiction will invite us to embark on an interstellar and intergeological journey that connects the Pilbara and Mars. This capsule explores radical imagination as a means to deconstruct the neocolonial escapist and extractive mythologies, the neocolonial escapism and extractive mythologies behind the current entrepreneurial space race. Inspired by the Afrofuturist merging of known Western cosmogonies with fantasy, alternate history, and magic realism, as well as with indigenous futurism's questioning of the underrepresentation of indigenous futurabilities in cultural media, this capsule invites us to imagine how to become Martian on Earth rather than an Earthling on Mars.
How to deviate from the current corporate space battle and the desire to escape from the planet into a desire to disidentify oneself in this planet.
Interrupt. Location or headland. Actual event. The Pilbara strike between the 1st of May 1946 and August 1949 is the longest strike movement in Australian history. Original people defied the owners of pastoral stations while reclaiming independence from their colonial patriarchal masters and the end of slavery. The three-year-long interruption became a fundamental milestone in the country's political history. The very act of interruption forced the necessary negotiations to address historical injustices by threatening the export of wool, which at that time was one of Australia's most lucrative industries. We recommend How the West Was Lost, a 1987 documentary in which the protagonist of the strike narrates the events. 68 years later, on the 6th of November 2014, tugboat workers threatened again the Australian economy by interrupting the iron ore export operations at Port Hedland, Australia's largest iron ore loading port, to leverage for improvements regarding poor labor conditions.
Act of alienation. Inspired by the interruption of Suez Channel, this capsule imagines a planetary strike that would combine hacked algorithmic systems, human and non-human alliances, and meteorological events to interrupt the current necropolitical death drive. It imagines the disruption of Port Hedland, the Pilbara's primary connection to the world, through the interruption of the constant dredging operations necessary to maintain the port's channel navigable. The disruption would be part of a distributed effort in alliance with other international events, such as the protesters' action on railways against the Atlantic Coast Pipeline in Canada, Fridays for Future, or the destruction of Trump's Mexico Wall by extreme winds on January 2020, amongst others. How can we instrumentalize territorial interruption?
What would be the implications of a planetary strike?
What does a strike become when full automation takes command?
Can machines strike?
Can non-humans strike?
Is climate already on strike?
How to challenge the anti-terrorist rhetoric used against climate change non-violent disruptive actions? Distribute. Location, 80 miles beach and Pinglangora, Asian Renewable Energy Hub. Factual event. The Pilbara's extreme exposure to solar radiation and wind and its privileged access to the ocean, as well as its recently discovered stocks of lithium and other rare earth minerals, position the region at the core of a battle for the widely announced global energetic transition. Solar panels, wind turbines, lithium batteries, and green hydrogen power stations are rendered as the hopeful promises of a new energetic regime. Only 20 kilometers south from the Pilbara's 80 miles beach, the proposed solar and wind megafarm known as the Asian Renewable Energy Hub would occupy 6,500 square kilometers, approximately half of Sydney's metropolitan area. It would become the world's largest infrastructure of this kind, providing renewable energy to Australia and several Southeast Asian countries in the vicinity. According to their defenders, the plan could enable the replacement of the current gas industry by the export of ammonia produced with green hydrogen.
Act of alienation. As a response to those who praise for a seamless global energetic transition based on the continuation of a paradigm of resources extraction, the green gold rush, this capsule imagines the instrumentalization of the global energetic transition as an opportunity to test radical political transformations. This capsule imagines the resignification of the Pilbara's Asian renewable energy hub into the site for the first post-labor metropolis in the world. Inhabitants in this city would literally inhabit the grid and engage with forms of kinship liberated from the mandates of productivity. Also inspired by the descent in lying flat trend amongst Chinese millennials that are quitting China's 996 work culture to live free of anxiety, this capsule imagines a full-scale urban laboratory in which to collectively experiment with the spatial and systemic implications of removing work from the epicenter of life.
Indeed, the clip on display shows the music video "Tamping is the Right Way" by Zhang Qiming, a singer based in Wuhan that promotes lying down as the right thing to do, as a form of resistance. According to the New York Times, the video and other tamping-related online material are being censored in China. Could this have become a post-labor city with horizontal redistribution of wealth, universal access to education, culture, food, health, and shelter?
Could this allegorical city become a planetary social condenser in which to imagine new forms of international citizenship beyond nation-state borders?
Could this energy hub become a full-scale political laboratory for slowing down economies?
Become location, Montebello Islands. Factual events. On the 2nd of October 1952, at 7:59 Australian Western Standard Time, the first British atomic bomb was tested at the Montebello Islands as part of Operation Hurricane. The area was selected based on its low human population rates and its presumed remoteness. The plutonium implosion device generated a 300-meter crater on the seabed. 2 additional blasts followed in the islands in 1956 as part of the Operation Mosaic. The Australian Prime Minister at the time, Robert Menzies, agreed that to test Britain's nuclear weapons in Australia was to cultivate international alliances with its quote-unquote great and powerful friends. 60 years later, 2 parallel comebacks revived the 1950s underwater memories of the region. On the one hand, the Montebello Islands have recuperated the previously blasted coral reefs and their decimated turtle and whale shark population. Indeed, a paradigmatic human-free paradise, quote unquote, mirrors the exceptional wilderness takeover seen at the Chernobyl exclusion zone. On the other hand, the second comeback, Australia's recent move to build nuclear power submarines after joining the AUKUS Defense Pact with its quote-unquote great and powerful friends, UK and the US, seems to be part of a now generalized revival of the Cold War anxieties that fostered the 3 nuclear detonations in the first place.
Act of alienation. This capsule imagines the sequestration and permanent archival of Australia's nuclear arsenal, including the recently commissioned nuclear submarines, as a means to commemorate the end of Australia's nuclear history. Montebello Radiological Reserve is a monument to the future, an unnatural reserve in perpetual becoming, a living and dying toxic architectural device only open for humans in 100 years' time.
Can the Montebello Island become a mausoleum for the end of the age of planetary civil wars?
Can Australia move from a war testing ground to a war de-escalation ground?
Can Australia move from a global leader in wildlife extinction to a global leader in wildlife proliferation?
The 7 presented acts of epistemic alienation do not attempt to force a resolution for the battles. Far from the top of architecture as a toolkit for solutions, These microfictions inhabit and intervene the battles with a threefold ambition. First, to render visible and challenge the existing power asymmetries. Second, to bring forward the agonistic potential for an open and urgent public debate. And third, to draw upon their irresolution as a visceral time space in which to test new forms of political imagination that can emerge.
In the next stages, the 7 capsules will combine forensic material, archival documentation, as well as existing and newly commissioned artworks. This long-term entanglement between GRANDEZA and BAJEZA and other artists, activists, scientists, thinkers, and other living and non-living things within and beyond the Pilbara's tentacular geographies will become the testing ground for emancipatory planetary alliances. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are you happy to take questions?
Yes.
Sure. Do we use the microphone perhaps?
I've always been very fascinated by this concept of familiarization, more as a sort of methodological approach to, I guess, until a sort of reality to make people, in a way, refamiliarizing to the reality itself, maybe a new concept, something that's lost in the over, let's say, automatization of perception and acknowledgement. Very easy questions. I would like to, since you mentioned that before, I was interested in which literature you refer to when you said familiarization. I mean, who are you quoting? Well, or your understanding of this concept.
I mean, the lecture was mentioning many of the references that we are using as an act of defamiliarization. I think that in our practice, the act of defamiliarization goes beyond the act of representation. It is like really intrinsic to forms of ontology as well, to like how we exist in this planet and how these processes of constantly questioning the way we exist, the way we relate to others, the way we practice as architects, and why we are doing so is somehow like really central to the practice. So all the references that we are talking about are really crucial for this act of defamiliarization, even if they are not specifically talking about that. Because when we are talking, for example, about Caliban and the Weeds, it is an account of history that we have read so many times, no? About what is the transition from feudalism to capitalism. We have heard this story in a way that it completely leaves aside the reproductive labor or the labor of the unweight. And Silvia Federici then becomes a crucial author to understand that we need to look at history in a critical way, right? We need to kind of not take for granted even the knowledges that are so installed in our thinking. I don't know if this is responding. So all the authors, Paul Preciado, maybe more about the questioning of gender as a political fiction, Judith Butler, I mean, yeah, or are you asking for a particular aspect of defamiliarization that you are interested in?
I was interested in the literature you're taking consideration.
Also, I wanted to add that we promised Francesca and Miguel that we would send you
an extended
bibliography of the lecture in a way. We haven't done it yet, but we will send it today. It's never late. I think that might probably help you kind of finding a little bit more about, like navigating the resources that we use. As Amaia was saying, for me, it's very important also to to mention the distinction between Alienation as a Method, which is probably one of the best books that I can recommend you to look at. The method of alienation would be probably Brecht and the Method by Frederick Jameson, which kind of analyzes all the theory of Bertolt Brecht from a kind of cultural and an epistemological perspective, looking at the relevance of it for the arts in general. And another source for that I could recommend you is to actually read Bertolt Brecht's own theoretical kind of explorations of the topic of alienation and many other topics of theater, design and writing during the time. But it's obscure, it's kind of obscure, but it's very enlightening at the same time. No? But that would be around the method of alienation, like methodologies for alienation. And I think that the effect of Brecht's epistemic transformation in the arts through the introduction of the notion of alienation has influenced so much all the artistic practices of today that basically Barthes used to say that he basically created a new audience. He basically transformed the audience. The process of defamiliarization was defamiliarizing the audience of the logics of representation of previous art paradigms. And that has changed to the point that still today Brecht is paradigmatic. We are in, I would say we are in a Brechtian paradigm, still in art, in cinema, in theater, everywhere. No? So I think that understanding that it's almost already a historical reference, but we are already embedded of it. So we are also, that's on the methodological aspect, but in the epistemic aspect of alienation, I think that almost any philosopher, any thinker that we are reading nowadays is engaging in forms of alienation. No? It's kind of looking at reality from like getting outside of oneself, no? In a way, to be able to see how things operate and kind of describing them from that position of estrangement, right? Which I think in a way is almost like philosophy is that in a way somehow, no? But I would say like probably one of the main sources of inspiration for the way we think and the way we look at reality in the last years has been Paul B. Preciado, which we have mentioned several times. And as Amaia was saying, his notion of gender itself as a political fiction. No? He talks about the somatek, talking about the body, no? Which is something that is very important for us, for you guys. The somatek is what he describes as the accumulation. No? He talks about the body as a living cultural archive that archives juridical, medical, cultural, racial discourses. No? So he takes the question away from biology, let's say, or from the natural, and he talks about the indexes that our body as a living cultural archive contains, right? And gender is one of them. No? And so he talks about the man as a political fiction that one decides to inhabit, to perform, to enact, or woman, no? And how this is something that is in dispute right now. He talks about, of course, in a much more manifesto way about a world without gender, no? The abolition of gender. And then like that's probably navigating the bibliography that we will send you today probably can help you getting further references of these notions.
Yeah, maybe just one key reference that we have been working with lately is also Unlearning Imperialism by Ariela Isa Azule. And she's a photographer, so she's more kind of talking about also all these inherited power structures and readings of the image that we all are somehow infected in different degrees in the way that we look at things. No? So another really interesting book that looks at the architectural typologies, actually, the archive, the museum, and she talks on also, she was a reference for the capsule of the strike, because she talks about everyone going on strike, no? How do we stop this perpetuation of the same logic? So yeah, the question of the familiarization in a way is almost like creating it, when it clicks on the way that you look at things, it's almost impregnating each of these references, even if they don't talk specifically about that, they somehow are moving towards a process of, which I think is what is fascinating about today's kind of paradigm shift, this interregnum that we are talking about, that all this is being put at stake, right?
Mhm.
Any other questions? It's along these lines a little bit. I'm curious as to this, in each of the projects you're proposing, the transfigurations you're proposing in the second half of the presentation. If the process of alienation, do you think it was, I don't want to say easier for you, considering you're not Australian, potentially, this distance, you're already alien to the country you're dealing with? Do you think it helped you potentially?
Well,
I think this is a question that came also in the first project that we presented, because it was the Australian pavilion. And even if we have an Australian passport, we don't sound like Australian, I think. But somehow I think that we actually do not feel from any other place very much either, right? Because we have been living in Germany and kind of then Australia, and somehow our forms of self-alienation go beyond this kind of Australian condition or Spanish condition. And I think that somehow what this project, the reason why we brought this project today for you, thinking that it would be useful for the exercise that you are doing, is that it somehow unpacks a methodological framework, right? It is a kind of a series of actions, then with their location, and then the project of imagination. And this could be applied to any other places in the planet. And going from this kind of allegorical condition in the local space, but then having these tentacular geographies that go even to the planets, right? So this, the fact of like being Australian or not, I think that didn't affect. I don't think it affected the project.
I just wanted to add very quickly that our very good friend and artist, and complicit artist in Teatro Della Terra Alienata, but now kind of we are starting to a conversation about how she will become as well one of the complicit artists that collaborate with us in one of the capsules of the Pilbara Interregnum, the one about the unseen,
the blind ill,
the unseen blind ill,
and
frame, is our fate Earths, which we've become friends through art making together in a way, I would say. And she's making a project called Alien Kin, not Alien
Loving
King,
the Alien.
Loving the Alien, no? Like making kin and becoming alien, no? And she,
the one with the green faces on the water, she
Yeah.
she took the picture. We were in the water, Miguel as well.
Yeah. And she was talking about this yesterday in the Lanzarote television because she was interviewed, and she was talking about how she has painted in green already more than 100 people, and how this is becoming a process of alien making. And everyone who has gone through that process, not because, of course, the color of the skin, but because of the collective enactment of a process of alien becoming, transforms the people. And then she talks about the community of aliens that the process of her performative practice has created, no? And that reminds me as well with to our relationship with Australia. And probably I'm here talking about something that probably Francesca and Miguel are also very familiar with, being an outsider, being an alien oneself, being an alien in the land, no, in Australia. And how most of our best relationships and friends that we have still in Australia and we love and admire so much are in a way also people that have been estranged themselves from society for whatever gender, sexual, racial, or accent reasons. Yeah? And then now that we've come back after 2.5 years to Europe, And we spent already like a month, and we might spend a couple of more weeks and months. We realized that we are other as well in our homeland to some degree. No, we will never be from Spain anymore. Probably, as Amaia was saying, we belong nowhere. Probably, and that condition of alien definitely helps you understanding so many fictions that people perform or enact without not even noticing, no? Like nationalistic notions of gender that are specific to every culture or country, etc. This definitely, like alienating yourself from your reality or your context helps you understanding all these things that then you read in the writings of amazing thinkers, and then you actually realize because you are able to see it because you are estranged already, let's say. Yeah.
So you were mentioning how a lot of corporations exploited the barrier reef, and one of them being Adani, who there were a lot of protests against what they were doing from locals who were so intrinsic to that environment, which were not alien to that process at all. They were embedded in that. So did that ever influence or affect your choice to look at this as an alienation, but through, or like if the bodies of protest, let's call them that, if that ever influenced your work of then looking at it as an alienated body?
Can you repeat the question?
So what I'm trying to get at is because you're talking about the Great Barrier Reef, and a lot of local people who live around it were affected by these exploitations of corporations, and there were a lot of protests that took place in smaller areas. To say like, no, we don't want this, or no, the environmental laws need to change, and we shouldn't be allowed to intervene in that reef. So it's very relevant to also the class that we are doing. We are talking about bodies that protest and who are not alienated to this process at all. They are very much a part of it. The journey one, yeah. But then your sort of intervention or take on it was that of alienation and looking at it from an outsider. So, but I'm curious to know what kind of friction, if you guys encountered while coming up with this project.
Yeah, the region is divided because the narrative around coal and the project of extraction is that it brings jobs to the region, is that what keeps the economy alive, not only to the region, but to the rest of the country. And so during the project, this has been like a 5-year research and pedagogical project. It started as a studio, and during the studio, we were traveling to the reef and to the industrial areas. So we were traveling to the harbor of Glaston and meeting with Aboriginal communities and with environmental activists, but also visiting the mines. So we were somehow trying to, in the trip, in the kind of also with the limitations that a field trip has as well, but we were somehow trying to establish a conversation to understand the different degrees of impact or the different degrees of support that these mines would have. And even if we were having, I mean, it was really interesting to see the relationship, for example, between extractive processes and the disputes between local Aboriginal groups, that some of them were supportive, some of them were not, and how this created a further division between them. But also the activists, the environmental activists, saying how the pressure of these mines in the region creating an effect almost of like a lack of freedom of speech, because they couldn't actually protest, they couldn't tell anything if they were seeing, for example, environmental damage happening in their own town. So it really had, it was an ongoing debate and also a taboo that many people wouldn't dare to bring into the public sphere because they would be seen as enemies of this project of profit, right? So what we are doing is almost, because also in the conversations with the environmental activists, they were not for the development of the minds, but still they were embedded in the conversations around sustainability as still a productivist project. So the project in Milan, the Teatro Della Terra Alienata, is actually a provocation that is moving away from this kind of a seemingly binary discussion between mine, not mine, sustainable solar panels, whatever development or extraction of coal. We are saying, no, we are going to test something completely different. So that, and this is why we were bringing the Xenofeminist Manifesto and this fictional corporation that was actually alienated this region from the capitalist logics, from the extractive logics. And this affects the mines, but it also affects the current framing of the reef as a natural park that is monitorized and that is also part of an economic logic of extracting wealth from its supposed natural beauty. No? So we decided to make this radical provocation to actually put it on top of the table everyone that is kind of engaged in the conversation and not willing to, and as a necessary step to move away from this kind of very reductive at the end conversation between pro and against the mining.
And I would just add that in that will to provoke, we realized that we provoke a lot of reactions, and that's good. I mean, because that's what we wanted, no? But we've seen also how many people would understand that many of the hypotheses that we are making are what we consider all of them. All of this is what needs to happen. No, we were just creating a fiction that was meant to provoke a conversation, a debate that is, we consider necessary, right? But we've realized, and we've been confronted with, in a way, what many like thinkers say, like it's a sentence mostly attributed probably to Mark Fisher, but also Zizek and Frederick Jameson have been coining it, that it's more difficult to imagine the end of capitalism than to imagine the end of the world, right? Yeah. And I would take that sentence even farther, and it's more dangerous. It's less welcomed to imagine the end of capitalism than to imagine the end of the world. And fictions in Hollywood showing the end of the world, apocalypse or post-apocalyptic scenarios, most of the time inhabited by a white male hero that is the last survivor, are very common. But fictions that question or that imagine the end of capitalist economies tend to generate much more friction. So that is an interesting thing that we've realized, no? That how difficult it is, and not only how difficult it is, how dangerous it is.
And I think that this is, and I would like to add something as well, that is in relationship to the concept of violence, because this project, in some cases, in some conversations, was framed as aggressive or violent, because we were alienating a region and kind of, and all the questions, if you watch the film, I don't know if you will have time to watch it in the seminar, but there kind of, many people were seeing the alienation from capitalism as a non-democratic act, no? It was almost like a takeover by the United Nations on why this is happening. But as Jorge was saying, it was a political fiction. And we also were claiming that there are like even stronger violence in place. And that what the project is doing, on the one hand, is talking about these current violences and then imagining this other alternative. And somehow the current violences, the violences that are not fictional, seem to be more, and we go back to the idea of normalization, seem to be normalized, no? Like we are used to see them, and even more now that we see war in media every day, you know. But if you kind of propose this somehow paradigm shifts, or this kind of moving away from the logics that we are used to, it's seen as dangerous, right? And it's kind of interesting because all our project has this condition of analyzing a local condition with factual events, and then this imagination and the factual events, unpacking that is kind of, yeah, that's fine. And then when you imagine something different, it becomes problematic, or it becomes like out of place. So when we were talking in the presentation about the power of telling stories, we have encountered already like this kind of stronger reaction to the forms of fictions than to the forensic space of the practice.
Miguel has a question.
I have a question for the benefit of our colleagues here, because they are now moving to the stage, you know, from a research, let's say, to something that has to crystallize in some sort of an artistic output, right? And I would like you to talk a bit about our concept of destroying, let's say, the references once you have them around you and you have all the different mediums and even systems of representation. How important it is to attack the completeness of this artifact and to destroy I use the term maceration as in kitchen, when you the hard meat to make it soft. How that destruction is intrinsic to the recombination then of the work and the references into something else, right? Not necessarily something new, but something else. Because I think they're going to go through that process very soon.
In the next 48 hours.
And it would be great to have you here, you know, as an example, because I think there's some intuition in the graphics, in the way they present the work, that I think it would be great if you can expand it for them.
But I can just start. Actually, we're gonna leave 2 of the books here for you to have a look today or these days. And actually, the autopsy of the book, which is kind of the chapter that closes after the whole script of the book, is called the Butcher Curators. And it basically claims that we operated as butcher curators, and that process implied
Butcher.
Sorry, the butcher curators. That process implied an act of butchery, a sanguinary act in which things need to be destroyed, and that implies destroying yourself and destroying your own belief system. No, like I think the beautiful thing about the process of destruction is that because it's an act of profanation, and profanation, I guess probably Miguel has talked about profanation already, not yet, but basically what Agamben said about profanation, with all my, I'm gonna apologize to Agamben before explaining it, because I'm gonna just simplify it so much that he probably would be ashamed about what I'm gonna say. But basically, the profanation is the act of taking something that belongs to the gods, or that the humans have given to the gods, and is kind of an act of retaking that for the humans to enjoy, and that that implies a process of breaking a sacred kind of trust, or a sacred kind of contract, right? And then the second part of the profanation is that taking that was sacred, that belonged to the gods, and giving it to the humans is for them to play, to become kids again, to be playful, to destroy by play, right? And I think that probably represents very much what we do, and that process implies that if you profanate something, in exchange you need to profanate yourself. It's very important that for us as well, every time we start a new project, we need to question the assumptions of what our work is supposed to do, or the type of formats that we are supposed to use, or because we don't want to become a brand that kind of repeats itself doing things. And as students, we've seen that as well. And I have to say that one of the main aspects of our practice that we haven't spoken that much today is education as well. And in the education process, we also use the estrangement effect, let's say. We want to kind of estrange the students. We kind of agitate students in a way to agitate ourselves back. And this process is a kind of almost making a reverberation in which everything can be broken, everything can be profanated, and it's a sanguinary act. But as we said in this article about the butcher curators, that sanguinary metaphor only kills kind of some epistemic notions of what curare is. The curare is to maintain the integrity of the work of art, to keep it safe, right? And we were basically chopping and cutting and re-editing the works of the artists that collaborated with us. No? So this process of editing right now, as Hito Steyer also explains very well in Cut and Reproduction, we are immersed in a world in which reproductions, cuts and transformations, degradations of quality of the videos by downloading and uploading, etc. So that we are immersed in a world in which post-production in a way has become production. No? And I think that you have to assume that you can steal anything. I would say you can take anything you like, because this is a process of learning, and no one will sue you for, you know, the copyrights of the use of the things that you use. No? And we do it as well a little bit in our practice, but of course we have to be more careful, because we put sometimes works in biennales, triennales, exhibitions, etc. But I think that this process of breaking things to break yourself back, and this is a sanguinary thing that becomes almost like a butchery in which you cut yourself as well, is very important. And probably you can navigate more a little bit more of the ideas in that autopsy, to if you are in this moment in which you have to engage in the process of, or in the methodology of creating something, probably that can help you.
I was just going to say a very brief comment in relationship to the process of creating. And I think that for us is very important, the idea of the vandal, and how we have been trained to look at history from a very hagiographic point of view, almost as a celebration of the masters that have constructed the knowledge that we have inherited. And I think that putting us in the position of the vandal when we start to create things and to question things brings a lot of joy to the process. So we are also using humor and absurd in this process of creation with a lot of rigor, and then we kind of get crazy into kind of making it work. And humor doesn't mean not making things with rigor. That is kind of, but it's a necessary tool for us always to kind of make also the project, each of the projects worth, and also somehow have a tension between the very sometimes depressing and like heavy moments of understanding the complexities of reality and all these kind of very big questions, and like what can we do as individuals. No? So it's an interesting tool to bridge these kind of different scales.
I think the rigor of humor is a great point to end on that you'll all be using. Thank you so much for this going on.